Welcome everyone to the week one of Trinity Term at the Newman Society. This week we're welcoming Father Joseph Evans, who is the Chaplain of Grandpont House here in Oxford. He is a priest of Opus Dei and a poet. He is the author of When God Hides, some extracts of which are on the piece of paper in front of you. And it's been published this year in Oxford University Press. SLG Press. He received a doctorate in biblical theology from the University of Navarra and teaches sacred scripture here in the United Kingdom. He is the former Catholic chaplain of King's College London and of Greygoth Hall in Manchester. And so, Father Joe, over to you.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And in Easter week, I was doing a retreat, a silent retreat. And so it was looked after by Duran. In Easter week, so it was looked after by a priest. There was a priest preaching all the meditations. I was just there listening and praying, or trying to. But apart from the priest giving most of the input, every day there was a talk from one of the laymen on the talk. So each day a different layperson would give a talk. And in one of these talks, the speaker, the layperson, told this joke. There's a lawyer, a priest, and an engineer who go to play golf. And as they're playing, there's another group in front of them. And it began to get a bit annoying because this group took forever. They kept on missing their shots. They kept on losing their balls. They couldn't find the balls when they hit them. There was constant confusion. They just didn't seem to know what they were doing. And it was really, and as a result, it took forever. They just had to keep on waiting for this group in front of them. And as a result, they got so annoyed at the end of their round that they went to see the course manager. And they complained, formal complaint. And the manager said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, I should have told you. It's just that this is a group of blind firemen. And, as a sort of charity thing, we let them use the course from time to time. But, sorry that I didn't warn you about this." And hearing this, of course, suddenly they were mortified. Their anger turned to sort of mortification. And the lawyer said, "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. I'm sorry about my anger. Well, look, on Friday, I'm going to dedicate my hourly rate to that charity for blind firemen," which obviously a lot of money. Lawyers earn a lot of money. So, and the priest said, "Well, on Sunday, the second collection is going to be for the charity of the blind firemen." Okay. But the lawyer Adam, the engineer Adam said, "But can't they play at night?" Now, by the way, the reason that the anecdote was all about, the talk was all about empathy, understanding, and it was a very good talk on that topic. There's chairs here if anybody wants. There's at least two of you. Somebody is here, or you might sleep and start snoring. Now, why am I telling that anecdote in a story in a talk about poetry? Because it got me thinking. And you've got your lawyer, you've got your priest, you've got your engineer. But what would be the reaction of a poet? Well, how would a poet react to this? Now, a Christian poet, I hope, would also, like the lawyer and the priest, not like the engineer, would want to help in some way and do something for them. But that's not sort of specifically poetical, So I was asking, what would he or she do as poet, specifically as poet? And does his or her poetry, does his or her Christianity, affect their poetry in this case? Now, hopefully, this poet, should he or she feel inspired to write about this episode, would do so with compassion, not mockery. He wouldn't be mocking the poor blind fireman. There would be some form of compassion. But again, that's not specifically poetical, is it? Hopefully any Christian would want to show compassion. It might prompt this poet to ask certain questions or have certain ways to see the situation. For example, how sin has led to physical illness in general and how we are all somehow blind. Could be a possible response. A bit like Hopkins, Gerard Manley Hopkins, in his classic poem, The Wreck of the Deutschland, saw in that shipwreck, a sort of metaphor for England's spiritual wreck due to its break from Rome. But again, maybe a philosopher or a theologian might think, the simple reflection that we're all damaged by sin. Well, is that specifically poetical? It's a theologian. Nathan might come up with that, but probably a lot better, and more about divine simplicity. But or a philosopher would come out. So, what might the specific response of the poet would be? I think essentially the poet would want to respond to this situation with beautiful, crafted, insightful language. Poetry is fundamentally about crafted language. It's painting, it's composing with words. But yet, again, it's a bit more than that, because you can have very elegant words, which in the end don't say that much. And you get some great poetry, or at least technically great poetry, which is quite empty. Sounds good, but it's empty. The good poet doesn't simply craft beautiful words. It's a whole approach to life. He or she somehow brings the whole of creation into their poetry. Just today, I was reading from Lumen Gentium, the Vatican document from the Vatican II, and it had this beautiful thing to say. It said, "The faithful, therefore, must learn the deepest meaning and the value of all creation, as well as its role in the harmonious praise of God." I think we're getting a little bit closer to what a Christian poet might do. You bring the whole of creation into your poetry. One aims to enchant creation, or rather, to see the enchantment already in it. So let's look on your handouts. Let's look at the first section from Gerard. For those, I'm sure 99% of you will know, but if there's a 1% who doesn't, Gerard Manley Hopkins is a great Victorian Jesuit poet. In my opinion, one of the greatest poets in the English language. And this poem is called God's Grandeur. I'm not going to read the whole of it. The title of the talk, "There Lives the Dearest Freshness, Deep Down Things," poetry. Well, that quote, "There lives the dearest freshness, deep down things," comes from this poem. But let's just read the beginning, the very beginning. "The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed." And it carries on. We'll just stop there. Well, what a wonderful image. There, he doesn't just say, the world is, the world wonderfully reflects the glory of God. He uses all sorts of metaphors. So the image of shook foil. You imagine your tin foil or aluminium foil, and you're shaking it, it's reflecting the light. For me, perhaps, as I'm not particularly, I use tin foil, or I don't use it very much because I eat from it, but I eat from what others do. So I can't say tin foil plays a particularly significant part of my life, but I do see it from time to time. But what a similar image that says more to me, and it says a lot to me from where I live and looking out onto the river, particularly in these summer days, is sun, the glint of sun on the water. And even more powerfully, the glint of sun on a summer's day, on a sunny day, on snow in some mountain. It's like an extraordinary glint, which for me somehow gives a sense of the glory of God. The glory of God shine. But for the metaphor for Hopkins is that if you've got eyes to see, the glory of God's everywhere. It's shining out of everything. Or like the ooze of oil crushed. Imagine you're crushing olives, and the oil is oozing out. Well, Hopkins is saying that the glory of God is so much part of things that it's like oil oozing out, or it's like, light shining off, the flash of light. If you can only see it. Well, that's poetry. apart from the quality of the language, the insights, the way he's drawing from creation. It's just you get a sense of his greatness. So a good poet has deeper insights, but they're not just philosophical. No teasing. This is nothing against philosophy. It's simply respecting, or nothing against theology. It's simply respecting demarcations and categories. There's good poets or good poems have depth with beauty. There's always an aspect of beauty, or recognizing beauty in nature, or in the human condition, or in the human person. Poor poetry, for example, would be uniquely philosophical or theological. Just go back to that idea about the poet who's thinking about the poor blind fireman, and he's thinking about the human condition, and that leads him or her to consider, we're all blind. We're all like these firemen. We're all blind in the face of the human condition, the human mystery. Well, yes, but a lot of people have said that. It's not a particularly original idea. You can, maybe a good poet could say it very, very well. But simply to say that, these blind firemen show that fundamentally we are all blind in the face of the human life and the human mystery. Well, that would be a sort of a middle rate poet would say that. I think a better poet would do a bit better than that. A good poet would see a bit deeper, but in a slightly different way. T.S. Eliot, who is, again, in my opinion, one of the greatest poets of the English language, a 20th century Anglo-English poet, Anglo-American poet, as great as he is, and he is absolutely amazing, in my opinion, he gets a little bit weak when he gets a bit philosophical. So let's turn to the next extract, which is from one of his great poems called Burnt Norton. Well, there's 4 quartets, and one of the parts is Burnt Norton. So do you want? Let's read. I've underlined the bits. After you can come back to me and say, Father Joe, I think you've said a load of rubbish there. I think you have no idea. You're complete ignoramus. But fine. But I've got 20 or so minutes from which you have to just listen to my opinions. But let's just listen to what I think that the underlined bits personally. And this is talk about presumption. Me criticizing T.S. Eliot. It's like a fly criticizing a lion. But I think this bit, the underlined bits, are a little bit weak. It gets good when the non-underlined bits. And that's the non-underlined bits, in my opinion, start to be properly poetical. So, time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. What might have been is an abstraction, remaining a perpetual possibility only in a world of speculation. What might have been and what has been points to one end, which is always present. Well, first of all, I don't know what on earth he means. And it's just, again, probably some of you guys, you're Oxford students, you're probably more intelligent than I am, but anyway, it's a bit clunky, it's a bit... but then he begins to show his genius. Footfalls echo in the memory, down the passage which we did not take, towards the door we never opened into the rose garden. My mind echoes thus in your mind. But to what purpose, disturbing the dust on a bowl of rose leaves, I do not know. Again, I don't know what he's saying, really, to be honest, but at least it sounds good. And, it evokes images, footfalls in the memory, passages we didn't go down, dust on rose leaves. It's evoking images. He's starting to be poetical here. It's a great poem, and he shows his genius. But even the best poets. I mean, Hopkins has his clunky poems, and Eliot has a few pedestrian poets. So even the greatest poets have their weaker moments. Poet or philosopher? I think a poet has to try to be an artist with words, and therefore is not as exact or exhaustive as a philosopher. You're not trying to totally solve the problem. A poet might draw out some deeper truth, but less analytically explained. He or she might express a feeling, a sense, might leave something dangling in the air. Truth can be hinted at or suggested and does not need to be rigorously explained. Indeed, at times it can't be, and the very effort to do so could damage the reality you're trying to convey. There's a truth beyond full rational explanation. Now, in the next extract, which is one of my own poems, I just give you a little bit of it because it's quite a long poem. I try and explore that idea a little bit myself. The poem is called Subtle. Okay? It's a poem which is partly personal, there's personal bits, but mainly about the masculine condition, what it means to be a man. At one point it's in this extract, you'll see how I contrast the masculine lack of subtlety with feminine sensitivity in every situation, which I see as like a poetical gift. Feminine sensitivity, for me, is like a poetical gift which we men lack. Anyway, this is just a bit of it. Subtle. I cannot be subtle. Drop a hint, a sudden glint, suggesting hoarded hidden gold. I cannot be subtle, the finest point, the thinnest joint, a wall's crack with a covert cave behind, a nuanced glance, feelings flash, a world's window beyond phrases, narrating through gaps. I cannot be subtle, that faint flash, her sizing sight, a word left feather floating, a telling look, silence speaking, the sphinx-like smile, the escaped tear held, her power in pity and pain, the heart's sign language delicately fingered. I cannot be subtle, the tracery of mist, escaping sight, evading grasp, nor paint the first fading glimmer of dusk, catch autumn's last fling of light, its dying, dazzling defiance. Well, I think poetry tries to do some of that. You know, a good poet, these are a few examples which I just hint at and don't, or to touch upon and don't explore. But I think a good poem will try to capture in words something of the tracery of mist. We'll try to discover some of that hidden gold. The hidden gold, just that glint or that sign, that word, that feeling which suggests hidden gold, that there's a lot more behind it. The poet will at least in some way try to paint with words the first fading glimmer of dusk. Keats does that very well, for example. Keats is an extraordinary poet, and things like describing nature, and he paints nature very, very well. Does faith add to poetry? Are you better for being a Christian poet? I think we can say that we naturally have recourse to poetry for our great transports, our great feelings. How much bad poetry has love inspired? More than one husband has, somewhere locked away some bad poem which his wife doesn't allow him to throw away, but some awful, cringy poem. Oh Susie, you are petite, but I think you're so sweet. I want to adore at your feet. Which at the time, seemed so heartfelt, but of course later on it's not so impressive. But it's very natural that for something like love, you have recourse to poetry. And all our great poets, typically you're feeling down, you write a poem to try and capture your misery. And of course, there's no greater transport, there's no greater sort of sense than the sense of God. If someone who's really got faith, and if anything should inspire poetry, it's God, isn't it, really? And if you really believe in God. And of course, the highest forms of prayer in the Old Testament are poetic. Bits of parts of the Psalms, the songs, and which themselves recognize that creation is itself a poem. It's a divine poem, a created poem. Let's just pick out a few little extra. So I've given you a few extra. I won't read them all, but here's actually one that's not a word that's not normally desperately poetical. The Book of Sirach, also called Ecclesiasticus, but which has some really very poetical moments. And at one point, the author, contemplating a snowfall, says, you got the whole quote, but I pick out the italicized bits. The cold north wind blows, and ice freezes over the water. It rests upon every pool of water, and the water puts it on like a breastplate. What an image. What an image. The water, frozen water, like a breastplate. extraordinary image. I just love it every time I get to it. And that whole section is celebrating God's work of creation, his artistry in creation. Or Psalm 19. Again, he's talking about the sun, but above all the action of the sun in creation. In them, he, God, has set a tent for the sun, which comes forth like a bridegroom leaving his chamber, and like a strong man runs its course with joy. Again, what a lovely image. The sun coming out like a bridegroom. Because obviously a bridegroom would be, you're talking, a newlywed who's delighted, he's so happy, full of in the ecstasy of love, coming out from that marital chamber. Well, the sun is like that when it comes up in the morning. What a lovely image. Or the whole of the Song of Songs. I mean, it's just an extraordinary. And I was just reading recently a book about the Song of Songs, where the author absolutely, don't. She says she's an Anglican nun, rest in peace. It's a very interesting work where she says this idea about Song of Songs being a sort of a secular love poem, which was then put in the Bible. I'm not sufficiently qualified to comment on this, but she is rubbish, load of rubbish. From the beginning, the author knew what he was doing. It's a love of God. It's a mystical poem. It's contemplative. Anyway, whatever it is, that's beyond my pay grade. But it's an extraordinary poem. The whole work is, and I'm sure it'll be even better in Hebrew. And I'll just read this bit. Just note, for example, the multiplication of metaphors, all of which from a rural setting, which of course one assumes and is almost certain that the beloved would get to. She would recognise the reference. It would mean a lot to her. I often joke, half joke, that if you have a girl, the lads, or your girl who wants to write to a lad, who doesn't know the Bible very well, and you're ready to cheat, just take a few extracts from the Song of Songs, and you'll give that person, him or her, extraordinary poem. Oh, how beautiful! Did you write that? Oh, yeah, of course, yeah. they anyhow. Listen to this. Just notice the multiplication of metaphors. Behold, you are beautiful, my love. Behold, you are beautiful. Your eyes are doves behind your veil. Your hair is like a flock of goats moving down the slopes of Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of shorn ewes that have come up from the washing, all of which bear twins, and not one among them is bereaved. Your lips are like a scarlet thread, and your mouth is lovely. Your cheeks are like halves of a pomegranate behind your veil. Your neck is like the Tower of David, built for an arsenal, whereon hang 1,000 bucklers, all of them shields of warriors. Your two breasts are like two fawns, twins of a gazelle that feed among the lilies. It's beautiful, isn't it? It's just so beautiful. Somehow, she draws it, and how this represents the relationship of God with the soul, or the soul and God. Notice in the poem the sense of scope, of wideness. The poet's having recourse to all creative reality, or at least all creative reality that he is aware of, that is within his experience. And I say that because often, unfortunately, a lot of poetry can be the opposite. It can be very self-focused, very narrow, staring at one's belly button, over-absorbed in one's feelings. It's a shame when poetry becomes so absorbed and, just sort of worrying about your own problems or your angst, or whether this poetry has such scope. Now, curiously, I don't know if you ever thought about this, there's not a lot of poetry in the New Testament. Although some of Paul's texts, have a hymn-like quality, so much so that obviously there's that common thesis that maybe he took them from existing hymns. Again, for scholars to debate that question. But still, whatever the answer, definitely some passages from Paul have a rhythm, they have something a bit extra to them, have a hymn-like quality. Why is it that there's not much poetry in the New Testament? My personal guess, my personal answer, is that because in the New Testament, our relationship with God gives way to intimacy, and even childlike intimacy. Poetry is great, but you can't spend all your time speaking poetically to your girl. Imagine you all the time, you are sort of, you saw in the morning, how are you? And you say a poem, for heaven's sake, what should we do today? And you give her a poem, I just want to know, are we going to Costa's or Starbucks? I mean, I don't want a poem, You can't spend all your time speaking in poetry. The moment comes when you need to speak simply, honestly and transparently. And I think we see that, for example, in our Lord's Last Supper discourse, John 13 to 17, where he's opening his heart, first of all, to his disciples, and then in chapter 17 to his Father. And this is what God wants from us, that simple, childlike prayer. So I think that would be my guess. Perhaps someone else, if anyone else has a thought on that, you might say, well, actually, there are poets, but no, if anyone has any thought or comments, please bring that up in the discussion. Beauty is, or should be, a key aspect of our lives. And the more open we are to it, the richer our life experience. But how present is it in your life? I mean, think about your own experience here in Oxford. One of the things that surprised me about Oxford, coming from the outside, is how left-brained Oxford is. It struck me a lot that a place that's full of humanities, but everybody's sort of analysing and giving sort of very rigorous academic, intellectual arguments. I don't get a lot of right brain. And maybe that might be something that perhaps we all need a bit more of, that right brain, that less analytical, that more poetical, that more sense of experience in beauty. Discovering the deepest freshness, deep down things. And in fact, actually, poetry, a lot of poetry is quite bleak and sad and tormented. Things like Ted Hughes, and it's miserable, really, apart from him writing poems about spiders copulating. It's just, honestly, anyway, I don't like Ted Hughes very much. And yet, actually, that, the deepest freshness, deep down things, even if it's good poetry, even bleak poetry offers a certain freshness, at least a fresh insight, a fresh metaphor. And the best poetry certainly discovers this freshness. It's easy to be sad. It's hard to be creatively joyful. Hopkins achieves it, which is a sign of his greatness. Some Christian poetry can be poor and of less worth, and too didactic. He's a better poet than me. Again, don't get me wrong. But George Herbert, I just find him a bit. He's a good poet. He's a great poet. He's a very good poet, and some of his poems are very beautiful. But I find him a bit simplistic. Either he's loving God or aware of his sinfulness. There doesn't seem to be much in between. Again, someone may think you blooming idiot. You're complete cretin for saying that. But anyway, that's just my own personal experience. Again, there's a lot of subjective here too. I can see one or two faces probably not impressed by that comment. Again, he's a better poet than me. Don't get me wrong. But I think Christian poetry alone does not foster. Christian faith alone does not foster good poetry. For example, I tend to personally think that the pre-conversion Eliot before his conversion, with some exceptions, some moments of absolute genius, is usually better than the Christian Eliot. So like the Wasteland and the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. I prefer. He gets a bit complicated and a bit too religious at times in some of his Christian poetry. But again, that is very debatable, and even in his Christian poetry, there's absolute amazing moments. But I do think, the greatest Christian poetry, like Hopkins at his best, like moments of Eliot, or some of the scriptural texts of like the above, does bring out this divine freshness. Some poets have bad moral. I was just discussing with Oisin about Yeats, and we both think that he's a bit bonkers. He's an absolute genius. His language is amazing, but he's nuts. And certainly his trashing all these poets who are far better than I am, but trashing that just idea. I mean, Yeats is an amazing poet. He's an amazing poet. He really is. His language and his command and his imagery is extraordinary. But some poets have bad moral ideas or a vision of the world at odds with the Christian vision. And what I want to quote is Rilke, Rainer Maria Rilke. Now, Rilke writes in German. I don't speak German. But I began to read a bit of Rilke, and I've had my run-ins about him with a certain member of this audience. And I don't like Rilke at all. I don't know him as a person, but he's dead. But I don't like his poetry. It's miserable. It's bleak. His Juno elegies are just absolutely they're depressing and weird, and there's a bit of some Freudian things going on there. No, but I do realise that this guy writes well, even in English translation, and so and there's a freshness, even with his negative vision. There's a freshness of poetic genius, of dramatic intensity, of great metaphors, and I understand from those people like Nick who do read German that there's an extraordinary freshness in the brilliance of his language. And I just put in again, this is in translation, I'm sure there's a lot missing, but let's just read this poem from Rilke, The Panther. Again, the poem's a bit bleak, but you'll see how fresh it is in so many ways. His vision, so obviously he's describing a panther behind bars. His vision from the constantly passing bars has grown so weary that it cannot hold anything else. It seems to him there are 1,000 bars, and behind the bars no world. As he paces in cramped circles over and over, the movement of his powerful soft strides is like a ritual dance around a centre in which a mighty will stands paralysed. Only at times the curtain of the pupils lifts quietly. An image enters in, rushes down through the tensed, arrested muscles, plunges into the heart, and is gone. Wow. I mean, even in translation, I don't know, the German must be amazing, but this is, first of all, it's a wonderful description of a caged panther. But actually, the more you look at it, the more you realise this is not a panther. This is a person. This is a person. It is also a panther, but it's a metaphor for a person who, in whatever form, is feeling caged, locked in. It seems to him there are 1,000 bars, and behind the bars, no world. Somebody who's in deep depression or feels complete, there's no way out. 1,000 bars, and even beyond the bars, there's no world. There's nothing beyond. His movements are like a ritual dance around his own sense of paralysis. We can do that. We can be dancing almost ritually around our sense of paralysis, our failure. It's so well described. Images rushing through tense, arrested muscles. First of all, note the contradiction between the two. How do images rush between muscles? Tense, first of all, rushing between, there's a contradiction. Rushing images and tense, arrested muscles. But it works. It works so well. You sort of, as if the muscles are like sort of channels or wires almost for the images to rush through, which are then lost in the heart. Again, the notion of images being lost in the heart. The heart seen as an abyss to swallow up feelings. It's a wonderful ideas. This is not a panther. This is a person who's having an emotional breakdown. So notice how, for all its bleakness, it's a rather miserable message, for all its bleakness, how fresh this poem is in its insight and vision. There's no cliches. There are no tired metaphors. Bad poetry uses cliches. It uses tired metaphors. Good poetry always has a fresh, even if the message is miserable, it somehow manages to describe that message, that miserable message, in a fresh way. Now, poetry is an art and a science. It's a craft. And for that, you need to read a lot. You can only write decent poetry if you read quite a lot of it. And which also includes poetry you don't like. I mean, a lot of the poetry I read, I don't like really. I mean, I've given you some examples. But you have to read it because it's good. And you learn from it. And it's talented. There's genius there. There's genius. Derek Walcott is a bit sad. He's a very talented poet. But he's just sad. But he's very talented. He's very, very good. So he's not going to cheer you up. But you'll realise this guy knows how to use a pen. He knows how to write. There's a lot of bad poetry, and I'm not necessarily encouraging you to add to it. But we all need some form of poetry in our lives, some right brain thinking. But maybe you could have, what for me is right brain thinking? What for me is poetry? Contact with beauty and images and metaphors. That's not analytical. That paints, that goes into, that sort of makes connections. I often feel that people who show mercy and empathy with such sensitivity are more poetical than I am. people with emotional intelligence. I got a poem, which is not one of my best poems, best within the mediocre, in which I describe a housewife at home. And how her whole life is poetical, her emotional intelligence, all the things she does, then the details, that's poetry. Her life is poetry. So I think it's a question of we're discovering our own form of poetry. However, contact with literature, with art, with music nourishes our poetical spirit. Poetry certainly needs more effort. Typically you'll have to read a text a few times, but is rewarded. It's worth the effort. It seems to me that poetry is ultimately an expression of our desire for communion. Even a rhyme, even a simple rhyme, your basic rhyme, just to take any one of my own. I've got some poems that rhyme and some don't. I'll just start with the first poem. It's not the best rhymes, but it'll do. I am here in winter 1516, looking afresh out the window of life. It seems at last spring is surging anew. Is the long barren freeze finally through? New rhymes like forest bluebells shoot up, rife as crime, or as guilty thoughts felt unseen. So that's not the best, because the rhymes are not so often. But no, it seems at last spring is surging anew. Is the long barren freeze finally through? Just the rhyme anew through. Well, even that it's two words seeking company, isn't it really? Those two lines feel the same by sharing the same rhyme. Or the rhythm of poetry, that good poetry that sounds good, like some of Hopkins. The words work together as a team. They create a greater whole. It's part of us. We need this community. We have a number of rowers here who could tell us all about what it means to be part of a team and how good it feels when it's working. When you're all working together, well, that's a good poem. And in your rowing, you're being part of a team. You're making a living poem. When you're working together and your muscles are working, they've got a number of poems about rowing. But a good poem is like that, with all the different rhymes and rhythms working together. Part of a whole. We need this communion. Poetry reflects our desire for communion. Perhaps in some ways we write poetry or we read poetry so as not to feel alone, so as to hear other voices and feelings and insights, ultimately to enter into the rhythm of the universe, which means ultimately to enter into the rhythm of the Trinity. Trinitarian life is the ultimate rhyme and rhythm, and poetry reflects and expresses this in some way. Adam, apart from the final few minutes just looking at some of my poems, Adam asked me to talk of, this is what he said, of what poetry can teach us of the divine. I think I've touched on that a little bit at least, and how you live this out as a priest of Opus Dei. Just a few words on that last bit. I think that request, what Adam says there, touches on the essential spirit of Opus Dei. St. Josemaria encouraged us to turn the prose of every day into heroic verse. He wrote in his at one point in his life, he was keeping these intimate notes in the 1930s, particularly in 40s. He wrote, "Ordinary Christians, a fermenting mass. Ours is the ordinary with naturalness. Means professional work. Everyone saints." It's just notes. In other words, sanctity in the ordinary, turning the ordinary into the poetry of love, doing things with love of God and love of neighbour. I try to keep this in mind, that the mundane, the usual tasks can have this poetry of love, although it's a constant struggle, and I often fail. Right, Adam asked me to dabble into my poetry collection. We've looked at one already, subtle, bits of it. This work, When God Hides, so this is the collection. So copies will be available afterwards for sale, I hasten to add. These poems were written between 2015 and 2023, when I was living first in London and then in Manchester. Manchester's always inspired me poetically, really. very much so. So all actually before I came to Oxford. I came to Oxford in 2023. Oxford's also inspired me poetically, but I felt that was a good gap, a good moment to, these were 8 years of poetic activity. I'd written poetry from a young age, but then for about 20 years, I went through a sort of poetical drought when I didn't really write anything of work. I wrote a few joke poems for birthdays and things like that. I wrote some poems when I was studying in Rome, one of which I think has a bit more worth, and one of which I radically re-edited and is included in that work called Rome. But I didn't, for some reason, there was sort of a 20-year experience. Wasn't writing very much. And then suddenly, in winter 2015, it just happened, rife like bluebells, or as guilty thoughts felt unseen, or rife as crime. Sorry, rife as crime, I think. It was a bit of play on words, a bit of a joke. But suddenly, like forest bluebells, poetry started to shoot up. I've just been in the Sussex forest the other day, and with all these bluebells around. But then at the same time, what was happening was that it was a curious experience. The experience continues a bit still. That I was, feeling very poetically activated, but actually spiritually quite dry, as if God was hiding, as if God was making it a bit more difficult. And yet, I still felt His mercy in this, and as if He was playing with me, as if it's a bit like playing hide and seek. And that motif comes up in a number of the poems. A bit of a spiritual dryness, but still which was an expression of God's mercy. And I want to offer 3 poems which are different in structure, content, and approach. I give you, we're not going to read it, but I give you Hopkins with the Windhover, just simply so you can see a poem that is far better than anything I could ever do. I just want to read, if you've got it here, I just want to give you the beginning of it. It gets a bit complicated by the end. You'd have to sort of, but it's worth the effort, and the more you explore it, the more brilliant you realise it is. But he's describing a falcon flying. I'll just read you a few lines, just to see the genius of the man. Even the things that I think he does wrong, like he divides kingdom over 2 lines. That's not good, but he's such a genius, he gets away with it, and he makes it good. But a lesser poem, if you were a teacher and someone tried to do that in school, you'd say, you can't do that. Hopkins can do it because he's such a genius. I caught this morning morning's minion, kingdom of daylight's dauphin, dapple dawn drawn falcon, in his riding of the rolling level, underneath him steady air, and striding high there, how he rang on the rein of a wimpling wing in his ecstasy, then off forth and swing, as a skate's heel sweeps smooth on a bow bend. The hurl and gliding rebuffed the big wind. My heart in hiding stirred for a bird, the achiever, the mastery of the thing. And he carries on. Even if you didn't understand that much, you can, with the second or third reading, you begin to get it. But just get the sense of that the very words describe the rhythm and the flight and the movement of the bird. It's extraordinary. And I think that's the thing about poetry, that poetry is as much about sound as about understanding. I often say that to people, don't try and understand, don't aim immediately for understanding. Listen, enjoy, get the images, get the metaphors, the sound. If it's good poetry, you'll have that. Anyway, 3 poems. Okay, the first poem, Bright Grey, is a bit more personal and reflects a little bit my own spiritual struggle. Quite a few of the poems do this, but I think with appropriate discretion. Okay, just very recently I've been reading an article about vulnerability and what is appropriate vulnerability, and how it's good to be vulnerable. It's good, in appropriate context to share your problems with others. And it's good to make ourselves vulnerable, although it's a risk, isn't it? Because people could abuse our confidence. It's good to open ourselves to others. But the author explains in appropriate ways. So we shouldn't show our wounds publicly seeking pity. But we could show our wounds to a good friend, or we could, to a good friend, express with appropriate discretion. Again, you don't have to go to confession to your friends. You don't have to tell them your sins. But there's a very valid, that I have this difficulty too, or blah blah blah. And that's part of friendship, isn't it? There's an appropriate sharing of wounds. I'm always struck by how Jesus showed his disciples his wounds, but they were glorious, not bleeding. Jesus didn't show look at me, poor me, how much I suffered, He didn't show his wounds for pity. He showed his wounds for their good, to express his love towards them. Anyway, and some of my poems, I wouldn't say show my wounds, but they definitely show my spiritual struggle and reflect where I really feel that, it's hard work, and it's still sometimes hard work. God seems to be hiding, and yet there's always mercy in that hiddenness. He's always, as it were, playing a game. You'll hear that this poem has formal rhyme and verse structure. And I just encourage you to listen out for the various metaphors and also some of the biblical references in the poem. Bright grey. Here in this bright greyness, in this mild chill, with spring pulling free from March's tight grip, like a small child determined to play, will in the hot-blooded passion of youth rip himself free from Grandad's cold, cautious hand. I struggle once again to heed your call. My soul roams mapless through a misty land, with faint echoes of your heavenly hall. I cannot see the heights you point me to, and so wander in the mudflats, reaching only the odd hillock with signs of you. Nor do I hear your voice, for your teaching is always soundless, or in blurred pictures, or traces of your past passage. Like fire's remains, some left scraps, a former fixture, and confused sentiments of deep desires. But as always, you trick me in this game. I never know who does the hide and seek, who conceals himself and who calls whose name, who wins the wrestle, who is strong, who's weak. The progress is never smooth, the going always slow. I slip back, fall, sometimes lurch ahead, tiptoe forward, but yet knowing, as lost as I am, love is in the search. Each day you caress me, show me the way. Your silence within me still softly sings. Each day you call me to come out to play. Each day I fly safely upon your wings. The second of the three poems is Velcro. There's a number of poems which are social commentary. And as you'll hear, hopefully you'll get it, I think you will. It's ironic all the way through. Okay? But I hope I make a good point and get people thinking, questioning precisely the whole lack of commitment in our society today. Velcro. You'll hear that it's free verse, which I think very much precisely reflects, it's not committing itself to verse, as it were. And that, good poetry. You can judge whether it's good or not, but poetry, the ideas should also be reflected in the structure. Velcro. Buttons are too binding. Their slit subjugation. Buttons are too blinding. Their slipped subjugation seems almost colonial. Zips mimic marriage and its antique oppression. Two lives too tightly clasped by locked teeth biting into each other. Buckles are for ancient buccaneers, suggesting heavy belts, fettering the waist, definitely not desired by modern Moors. Hooks are hateful. They point to pirates and cruel steel cutting into flesh. The metal hook and eye, most certainly outdated, awkward to handle, resisting swift release. Laced fastening can fail, leaving you literally tied together in a tricky knot. It simply won't do or undo. Snap fasteners suck you down, swallowing freedom. Removal should always be trivial. Magnetic fasteners signal power. Magnetic fasteners signal power we can't control, not to be recommended. Only Velcro comes undone with an effortless tug, temporarily bonding, but with easy extrication and no wounds to heal. The liberated surfaces meet and depart with no hard feelings. Hail Velcro, the fastener of our age. And then the last poem, although I've written it in the first person singular, is not actually about me. And again hopes to get the reader thinking, particularly those who need to consider on what foundation they're building their lives. I opted for the first person singular, the I, because I felt the second person would be a bit too much direct, a bit too in your face. In that sense, it has a more obvious evangelizing purpose, I suppose, to challenge the person. If not exactly didactic, then at least you might say, well, actually, I think it is didactic. Well, that's your decision. You might be right. It has a very simple, very, very simple and formal verse and rhyme structure, but hopefully, in its simplicity, it challenges the reader. Let's read it. My chocolate clock. Can you hear me? Why a chocolate clock? What's all this about chocolate clocks? Maybe think about that. My chocolate clock is melting. The white bits have run down. What once was so exciting is now a sorry frown. I thought it was so clever to have a clock so sweet. I really didn't ever envisage this defeat. I thought that my life always sugary would be. I thought that all the doorways would open wide to me. But soured now by guilt, I age and feel life shock, wishing I had built upon more solid rock. Right. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you.